tuning in to the Eggman Empire. Authorization approved. Access granted.
What's happening, little boys and little girls? My name is KotyTang. With the grand success of Sonic Prime Part 1, what a joy it is to be able to watch another 8 episodes of this ongoing show. We'll soon be heading into the finale of Sonic Prime, and if you're watching for a review, welcome to the video. If you're watching it as Part 3 comes out, welcome to the recap. And of course, if you've never seen the show at all, I'm here to tell you all about it. If you haven't seen my review of Part 1, be sure to check that out before or after the video. I don't really care when you see it. In this video, we're going to see how well Part 2 holds up to Part 1. We're going to be doing this a bit differently than the first video, where I described how Sonic Prime is written amateurishly. This time, we're going for a full overall approach, as most of what I said in Part 1 still applies to Part 2. And when Part 3 comes out, I'll be doing the same. Now don't worry, I'm not going to be giving you a minute-by-minute recap of every single episode of every single moment. I'm only going to be hitting the key moments of each episode. So if I leave something out, let me know in the comments below what you guys feel about the show and any theories you have, or anything you could think of as you watch the video. I pretty much respond to every single comment I get, so don't be shy to talk to me. While you're down there, go ahead and hit that like button and subscribe for more Sonic, lore, and writing content. Now, let's take a deep dive into how Part 2 of Sonic Prime holds up. Episode 1.
When you broke the Paradox Prism, you broke a reality.
Beginning the very first episode of Part 2 with Shadow is a great idea. We were given next to no time with him originally, but now we'll finally get to see just what Ian Hanlon actually brings to the table as Shadow. And what we get is the greatest representation of Shadow that we've had since Sonic 06. Now, I was really cautious about confirming whether or not Shadow was going to be written well in Part 1. When we first saw him, he appeared to just be an angry guy and pretty unreasonable even. But in Part 2, Shadow comes into his own as a character. Ian Hanlon's voice as Shadow has actually grown on me throughout this part.
A moment ago you said, Sonic, you literally broke our world. Why would I trust you to do anything?
Shadow actually presents us with what I think is a very important part of a comedy in general. The grounded character. While every single other person acts like they've just been hit with 80 vials of laughing gas, the grounded character is the only one that brings any sort of logical reasoning into the show.
Exactly. Don't.
I wasn't going to touch it. I was just pointing at it to tell you not to touch it.
Sure, they could still be funny, but they're the most likely character to keep everybody on track. In a sea of idiots, there has to be at least one character that makes sense. While 9 did fulfill that role temporarily, he was quickly captured, and then we were left to a cast of cartoony goofballs. So when Shadow finally does show up, it presents an obvious tonal shift to what we've been shown so far. Shadow finally throws away the self-centered, ignorant, narcissistic act to present everybody with a much more nuanced and well-rounded character. If written properly, whenever Shadow is presented, it should be near impossible to not write him as one of the most three-dimensional characters of the entire cast. The three-dimensional writing should generally be the case for every character, of course, but Shadow should be among the easiest to do this for. Throughout the years that we've seen Shadow, even with his short amount of time on screen, he has always proven to be such a captivating character. And the joy of Sonic Prime is that this time we get to watch him without the anticipation of rolling our eyes and being aggravated. The very fact that Sonic Prime has been able to write for Shadow the way that they have and display him to the mass audience is huge for the franchise. New and old, nobody is going to accept Shadow being written like an asshole anymore. Nobody is going to accept that he's caught up in his own hubris or that he's too self-centered to care. Not only is Shadow's personality going to be received extremely well, it may be a clear indicator that the mandates are lifting all around. Really, Sonic Prime itself has proven to be a shattering force for these mandates already, which is perfect. The only thing that I have concerns about is too much being carried over from the TV show. With its massive success, will Sonic's personality just be this now? Are we ever going to return to the laid-back, freedom-loving attitude that Sonic used to be known for? I guess only time will tell, but I really do hope that Sega has finally opened their eyes and realized after over 10 years of straight hate that Shadow was long overdue for a change. If you haven't seen my video discussing Shadow, I suggest either watching episode 2 of part 1 or taking a look at my video on that episode, because what I'm going to be talking about next directly relates. In part 1, Shadow sees a vision from the future of this strange twisting structure, and it doesn't really have anything else around it. It's just this twisting thing in a void by itself. In our eyes, obviously we know that this is Sonic. However, in Shadow's eyes, there's quite literally no possible way that he would have seen Sonic in this scene. The speed that Sonic is running doesn't even make him visible. He's a blob of blue, certainly, but this could be anything, and it's not clear that it's even a person. Only at this moment in part 2, episode 1, would Shadow be able to confirm that it was in fact Sonic who he saw in his vision. This should have been the moment that he realizes that Sonic was the spinning object. Before this, there was no reason for Shadow to accuse Sonic of anything. The only person that Shadow and every single member of the cast would have attributed a catastrophic event like this would have always been Eggman. So for Shadow to just assume that Sonic caused this explosion always made no sense. What's even more strange is that this shot here gives the implication that Shadow just now found out that Sonic was the vision that he saw. So if that is the case, then why was he blaming Sonic at all? When meeting Shadow, Sonic actually thinks that this isn't Shadow at all. Why Sonic would think this Shadow, who is so obviously just normal Shadow, isn't Shadow, doesn't make any sense. Thanks to 9 in part 1, Sonic is fully aware of what this floating place with all these rocks is. So why he even makes the assumption that he somehow traveled to another dimension doesn't really make any sense either. And I'll get back to all that in a moment. Let's keep going with this episode first. Something interesting happens in this episode for a little bit of foreshadowing. The Chaos Emerald that Shadow had is dropped into the darkness of the abyss. Sonic asks what's at the bottom of the void, and Shadow explains that it's an eternity of darkness that decays all life. Now there's no possible way that Shadow would have actually known that it decays life, but apparently he just knows that. There's no way that Shadow could actually confirm this unless he himself went down there. It's dark and scary, okay. It decays life though? Here's some food for thought. Why is it that Shadow has been in the void and has been the only thing in the void, but has somehow never taken it upon himself to go and interact with 9 and Sonic? In part 1, episode 6, when Sonic and 9 are heading to the Grim, the two are actually floating in the void for quite some time. Sonic explains his entire adventure up to that point, and then they continue having a discussion before finally going into the Grim. Shadow apparently not once ever thought that he should interact with them. 9 even travels to the Grim by himself, alone, where his ship almost fails, and Shadow isn't once like, maybe I should go check that out. Green Hill Zone is finally revealed in this episode. Something appears to be very wrong with it, as though it never fully formed correctly for an unknown reason. But on the plus side, it's the one place that Shadow can actually enter. So as long as Sonic can bring the Chaos Council here, Shadow will be able to help out. The obvious negative is that Shadow cannot enter anywhere else aside from the void. While in Green Hill, Sonic comes into contact with his friends. Clearly holograms, Sonic can literally see right through them. They're not even looking at him as he talks to them. In fact, to even find them, Tails started off talking to himself, and then when Sonic got up to him, he literally repeated the same exact line.
As long as I'm around, you'll always have a wingman. long as I'm around, you'll always have a wingman.
Sonic not being able to tell that everybody here is clearly some sort of projection is pretty annoying. After returning to the temple, Sonic and Shadow discover that there's a place to set all of the shards. The two agree that they should collect the shards and bring them back. However, Sonic and Shadow come to blows with each other over the fact that Shadow believes Sonic is way too reckless and irresponsible. Shadow believes that the technology on Sonic's shoes and gloves is what allows him to travel through dimensions. So basically, Shadow decides that he should actually be the main character, so he attacks Sonic so that he can steal his gadgets. The immediate difference between this fight and the first fight these two had is that the second fight has a reasonable goal to be met. This goal immediately makes this more enjoyable to watch. There's an actual question to be asked here. Is Shadow going to be able to take the gadgets from Sonic? How will he do this? Is Sonic going to be able to stop Shadow from taking them? How will he do this? If Shadow gets the gadgets, will he be able to go in the dimensions? And how will Sonic be able to leave if Shadow gets the gadgets? Shadow actually does end up winning the initial fight, forcing Sonic to find a way into the void, where the fight continues. We know these two aren't trying to kill each other, but a clear goal makes it actually interesting to ask who would win the fight here. In part 1, the only reason these two were fighting is because of a poorly written misunderstanding and Sonic just being a genuine dickhead. The questions you'd ask there aren't questions, it's just an obvious conclusion. Well, Sonic has to win this fight because otherwise he wouldn't make it to the prism and cause himself to go to New York. We even know that Sonic gets to the prism with plenty of time to spare. Even if we didn't know that Sonic was going to go to the prism after, the lead up to the fight is pure nonsense, and the reason that the fight even keeps going is arguably even worse. All Sonic has to do is be like, Shadow, we're trying to stop Eggman, you wanna come join us? And the fight immediately ends. But that's not what happens. Instead, Sonic is just like, oh yeah, wouldn't you like to know what I'm doing?
But I'm supposed to be on a bit of a mission here, Shadow.
What mission?
None of your business.
Part 2's fight not only has narrative weight, it actually makes perfect sense and doesn't feel like the two are fighting just because of some quota the writers need to hit. The fight ends with Shadow defeating Sonic and gaining access to his gadgets. However, as it turns out, the technology does not in fact allow Shadow to go through gateways, meaning that Shadow is the only outlier, as every other person can enter a dimension and leave at will. Unfortunately, there is still an inconsistency in the writing before the fight begins. Shadow says that he saw 9 give Sonic the technology on his hands, which shouldn't have been possible. When Shadow does see Sonic, he can only slightly see what Sonic is doing, and that's only when he kicks up Prism energy. It's not like Shadow is just floating in the void and seeing the dimension through Sonic's eyes. It specifically shows that Sonic has to be running to give out a large enough amount of this energy. And those are the only times that Shadow can not only see, but interact with Sonic. And even then, it's only Sonic, not his surroundings. So Shadow wouldn't have been able to even see 9. Because that's true, there's no possible way that Shadow witnessed 9 give Sonic the gadgets. When Sonic explains that 9 gave him the technology, yes, it makes sense then that Shadow would know that 9 gave it to him, yet it doesn't make sense how Shadow would have came to the conclusion that the gadgets let Sonic travel through dimensions. But as the episode is written, it's clear that Shadow is saying he knew all of this before Sonic even told him. Now this is a deep dive into the writing, so we're actually gonna go even deeper. At the beginning of the episode, it shows flashes of Sonic in New York every time Shadow hits the gateway.
My shoes.
Attach these. This energy is still a mystery.
Unless you're telling me that Shadow had been punching the glass for hours, then it's highly unlikely that these were supposed to be flashes into Shadow's mind. What I'm more than certain this actually was is cinematic buildup for when Sonic eventually pops out of the gateway. This is also reinforced by the fact that Shadow doesn't show any sign that he's seeing anything until Sonic specifically comes out. And again, Shadow specifically says that he only saw Sonic when he kicked up a bunch of prism energy by going fast, and then it makes Sonic pop out of the gateway. Shadow says that he assumes Sonic can travel through dimensions because of the tech.
I thought the tech would get me through the gateways. Why didn't it work? I saw 9 give you the tech. In the lab, you kicked up the prismatic energy when you ran fast and crossed over into the void. I just assumed it was the tech.
So let's assume that these actually were flashes into Shadow's mind. Alright, then Shadow would actually know that Sonic had the prism energy problem long before the gadgets were introduced. And if he could see Sonic throughout, the first and second flashes are literally Sonic using the prism energy before it's trapped in the technology, and the next 3 flashes are Sonic gaining this technology and 9 explaining the prism energy and what the gadgets are actually designed for. On top of this, before Sonic even got the gadgets, Shadow chases him until he flies right through the gateway of New York, and Shadow is completely barred from entering. It's a pretty huge inconsistency. Sonic and Shadow come to an agreement that they have to work together, and Sonic regains the technology. The Chaos Council start traveling across the void, and Sonic once again begins his journey across the dimensions, with Shadow being left to lend minor assistance in the void. Episode 1 did a great job at setting up the premise of Part 2. We uncover a mystery about Shadow's inclusion. Why can't he enter the dimensions but everybody else can? Will there be a way to get Shadow into other dimensions? Will this be through going down to the Abyss and retrieving the Chaos Emerald? We see that the Chaos Council has officially begun their quest across the dimensions to take the prisms. We finally get the inclusion of the true Green Hill. We present conflicting views. Shadow doesn't trust 9, while Sonic believes that 9 can be trusted. We know that 9 wants to make the Grim a new home, but how will that conflict with Sonic wanting to bring the prisms back to Green Hill? We also set up some foreshadowing. The Abyss, where the Chaos Emerald fell, and finally, we give our heroes a new goal, taking the prisms out of the dimensions and returning them to their rightful place in Green Hill. So it sounds like we have a lot to tackle in Part 2. Before we go to episode 2, I have to point something out that I didn't really point out in the first video. Yes, we know that Sonic is still unbelievably stupid, but it goes deeper. There's a common trope in writing. Generally, amateur writers have this problem. You can call it whatever you want. The viewers are morons, readers are morons, the audience are morons. But essentially, it's when a moment happens in the writing that the writer feels has to be explained, or else nobody will understand what's going on, regardless of how obvious it may be. See, the writer doesn't trust you, the viewer, to comprehend what you just saw and what you just heard. You know that part in manga or anime where the characters start fighting each other? And you can clearly see that one person is winning, but we have to pause so our side characters can express how one character is winning. Yeah, anime pretty much always thinks you're stupid. And Sonic fulfills this trope to a T. He never understands anything at all, even when it's extremely obvious or has already been explained to him a dozen times. This trope is also why nobody in the show ever references things that the majority of people who come to watch this show would understand, because the writers assume that it's the first time anybody will ever have seen Sonic. While you can find Easter eggs and references to previous things about Sonic in the background, next to nothing will be referenced directly over fear of the viewer not understanding it. It's not entirely necessary to go into detail about something that may have happened before in the past, unless it's conducive to the plot. A quick nod is all you need, and I promise, majority of the audience will immediately go, "Hey, I remember that!" A good example of the writers thinking you're stupid, Sonic goes to Green Hill and sees obvious holograms of Tails, Amy, and everybody else, Yet Sonic has no idea that they're holograms at all, and he even tries to interact with them before it finally hits him. Oh, these guys are translucent and repeating the same thing over and over. Oh, of course. How could I be so foolish? Even later on, we'll see Sonic shocked that there's a metal version of himself. Any fan of Sonic knows that Metal Sonic is one of Eggman's most iconic creations for his empire. The thought that Sonic is surprised to see a metal version of himself is pure nonsense. Oh, it doesn't end there. We can go even further with the assumed stupidity of the audience. In part 1, we witness Shadow tell Sonic that if he keeps running, he'll teleport.
Keep going! Do not stop!
Shadow?
And we already know that Sonic running causes the Prism energy to act up, thanks to part 1's explanations on the topic.
Knew it. He's got the same energy that powers the city.
The energy field is supercharging our systems!
Yet, of course, in episode 1 of part 2, we have to be told yet again by Sonic and Shadow that running fast causes the Prism energy to act up, thus allowing Sonic to teleport.
When you get going fast, you kick up prism energy, and it thins the veil to the void.
So that must be how I teleported into no place. I was looking for 9, I started running fast, and then suddenly, I portaled out of New York.
We already know this, so why are we being told this again? Sonic even already knows this. The writing style, where they assume the audience is stupid, creates some very interesting contradictions and inconsistencies in characters as well. This is why Sonic gets surprised when Shadow is the real Shadow. Sonic thinks that Shadow is a different version of himself, even trying to guess what version of Shadow this would be, jokingly referring to him as
Sheriff Shadow of Floating Rock World.
There's not even anything that indicates that this Shadow isn't Shadow. Every time Sonic went to a new dimension, there were several significant differences to take note of immediately. Sonic would also already know that he was in the void because 9 literally took him here and explained what this place was. Instead, Sonic thinks that he's in yet another dimension. This would actually be the only time that it would make sense for Sonic to almost immediately know that he's seeing his actual friend. He's never seen or heard a single mention of Shadow at any time. On top of this, he kept seeing the real Shadow throughout the show. I will say that Sonic's interaction with Shadow is in line with how Sonic Prime writes Sonic, so I think that kind of gives us an idea of how much Sonic pays attention, right? So we can confirm that Prime Sonic is oblivious to the majority of things and can't comprehend pretty much anything. And here's where the inconsistency happens. Sonic notes to 9 that he remembers traveling through the void when he crossed dimensions.
I think I crossed through here every time I entered the other worlds.
Sonic was able to pay so much attention in this quick transition that he immediately recognizes the gates that he's been through, correctly naming Boss Cage and No Place as he travels with Shadow. So now the show is saying that Sonic is so observant that he can deduce minor details like his 2-second transitions into the void, as well as the colors of each gateway. But he is completely oblivious to the fact that he's in the void again with Shadow. Or what about when he meets the Jungle Gang and doesn't understand that they're brand new characters, donning entirely new appearances, not even acting the same as their New York counterparts. And on top of this, he remembers being launched to an entirely new place. Before Part 1, Episode 6, Sonic has only been to Boss Cage Maze, so he's only done the void transition one time. He doesn't remember it in New York because he didn't see himself go to New York. How is it that Sonic can catch key details such as him traveling through the void and the color of the gateway he entered, yet he can't even understand that there's something clearly different with the Jungle Gang compared to New York? He's so observant about the colors of the gateways, but he can't even immediately notice that there's something wrong with his friends in Green Hill. He's so observant with the colors of the gateways, yet he doesn't notice that he's in the void again while simultaneously remembering that he's been in the void before. Sonic immediately remembers that touching the prism will teleport him, so in Boss Cage Maze, after digging up the prism, Sonic wraps it in a leaf so that he doesn't touch it. Yes, it's a clever way to get around the problem with the prism, writing-wise. However, character-wise, it actually makes no sense, because they have written Sonic to be an oblivious, slow-thinking moron. I'm more than certain that you've all noticed things yourself, so feel free to share in the comments below the contradictions in Prime Sonic's stupidity, or extremely important things that he's very observant about, but not something else that is even more important, if not equally important. If you haven't noticed anything, I suggest giving the show a second watch, with what I've just talked about in mind, and just for something to look out for, I'll give you a freebie. Another instance of out-of-character acting for who Sonic's been shown to be in Sonic Prime is when the real Dr. Eggman is actually created in the form of a Titan. Notice how Sonic doesn't even interact with the fact that the Titan is the real Dr. Eggman. He isn't surprised to see him, and he doesn't even take the time to point out that it's the real Eggman. Yet, every other time Sonic sees something or recognizes something, he feels the need to point it out. But for whatever reason, he just doesn't do this for real Eggman. So while you're rewatching Prime, take note of all the unimportant or obvious things that Sonic feels the need to point out. See, Sonic's here to explain to the low IQ viewers everything that's going on. And the moment he doesn't explain something, well, it's because somebody else already explained it a couple minutes ago. Although, funny enough, sometimes he will explain what has just been explained, just to make sure you got it. Assuming the viewer is stupid, create scenarios like this all the time. Let the viewer put things together themselves as it goes on. You don't have to spoon feed us if you literally show how something works and explain it in the same breath. It's not a grand reveal of how something works if you've been showing us how something works already. You're just telling us what we already figured out. As the viewer, we learn with our perspective character. Of course, for visual media, it's easier to show multiple perspectives, but the rule is mostly unchanged, as there's usually a primary perspective we're following. If Sonic learns something, then you should pretty much always assume that we, the viewer, just learned that same exact thing. So to explain it later, as though it's a brand new reveal to our perspective character, can be extremely pointless. Usually, you're just going over what we already know, because we were supposed to have learned this with Sonic. But for some reason, Sonic isn't picking it up as fast as us. Of course, there's a term called dramatic irony, which is when we, the audience, understand the actual scope or ramifications of something more than our perspective character does. A form of dramatic irony happened early on in Sonic Prime, when Shadow saw a vision of Sonic spinning in the void. We knew it was Sonic, but Shadow sure didn't. Another good example of dramatic irony is if you played Sonic Adventure 2 and started playing the game on the hero side first. When Sonic was captured by Gun, he was arrested in a helicopter, and after he escaped, he continued to be chased by the military, until it's revealed that Shadow was actually mistaken for Sonic. So we learn who Shadow is, and why Sonic was arrested with Sonic. If you reverse that, and instead you play the dark story first, you would find out that Shadow was mistaken for Sonic after he stole a Chaos Emerald. So when you switch to the hero story and play the opening, now you, the audience, have the full scope of what Sonic is being arrested for before even seeing Sonic. But of course, Sonic has no idea why the military is chasing him. That's dramatic irony. So if the Chaos Council learns something, or another character such as 9 learns something, it's perfectly understandable that Sonic wouldn't know something and would have to have it explained to him. But dramatic irony is not Sonic learning that he can run fast and jump through dimensions, and then learning it again 2 episodes later. There's nothing dramatic about that, and there's no secret revealed to Sonic. He should have found that out the same time we did. If it takes him forever to find out simple facts like this, it means we're following a dumbass. And he becomes a character that we have to annoyingly watch fumble around on the most obvious things that we already found out ages ago from one line of dialogue directly said to him. To end the topic of Sonic's stupidity, something else that I find annoying about Sonic is his wishy-washy athletic ability. He performs great feats of acrobatics and proves to be extremely capable in a fight, yet for whatever reason, he can't seem to ever land properly. It can only be that he's doing this on purpose, apparently wanting to hurt himself in some sort of masochistic fetish, because why else would he willingly let himself fly face first into the ground so many times? He can even homing attack in the air, giving him magic propulsion, as we see in part 1 and part 2, so why is he landing like this?
Wait, is that water? Please don't be water, please don't be water, please don't be water! Is that lead? Almost there!
Sonic can somehow magically draw himself to things when using the homing attack. If you can't really explain how exactly he does this, then there aren't really any rules about how a homing attack is executed, are there? So the full conclusion is that Sonic is face planning for fun. Shadow and many others seem to be capable of recovering from leaps like this, just not Sonic for some reason. Episode 2.
For Boss Cage Maze!
For Boss Cage Maze!
In episode 2, Dr. Don't and Dr. Babble are sent to Boss Cage Maze to retrieve the Prism Shard. Sonic's genius brain comes to the conclusion that the shard hasn't been found yet, so that means that the shard hasn't been found yet.
So if the Chaos Council is still looking for the shard, that means they haven't found it yet.
Genius. A Deus Ex Machina is when a seemingly unsolvable problem in a story suddenly gets solved by something pulled out of the author's ass. In episode 2, 9 just reprograms Sonic's gadgets in the most convenient way possible. How you reprogram everything, of course, by just running an electric current through a robot, and now Sonic can not only communicate with 9 through his gloved hand, but also be able to touch the shards without teleporting.
I'm reprogramming the regulators so we can communicate through them. You'll also be able to make contact with the shards in any way without risking teleportation. Something I picked up from being here.
Yeah, explain how that isn't an absolute Deus Ex Machina. 9 says that he picked up this knowledge from being a prisoner. So you're telling me that a simple reprogram, in whatever way this is, was all it took to make it so that Sonic wouldn't be forced to jump through dimensions. It's not like anybody else in the show has this problem. Every single person can freely touch the prism. The only person who would teleport because of them was literally Sonic. So do tell, what exactly is it that 9 could have possibly learned to have gained this information? After a long and drawn out struggle, the Chaos Council takes the prism from Boss Cage Maze, and Sonic uses those friends to launch him through the portal before they leave. This act of teamwork is going to be important later, so remember it. Episode 3.
High five?
Dr. Deep and Dr. Dunnett are sent to search for the Prism Shard in no place. They immediately come into contact with the pirates through pinging Rusty Rose's location. The two doctors find out that Captain Dread and the pirates have taken one of the Council's ships for themselves. After frying the power of Captain Dread's ship, the Council decides to leave Rusty Rose. First of all, that's one hell of a design flaw to have the core of the ship on one of the highest points, completely unprotected and out in the open. Secondly, I don't understand why this is such a common writing trope for villains. abandoning a member of their own crew completely unimpeded and left perfectly safe. Obviously, Rusty is gonna start working with the people that they just left her with and get revenge. Every single villain ever would immediately want revenge if that happened to them. So it just creates another enemy for them. And Rusty isn't like the average robot. Rusty is literally an advanced robotic being harboring an advanced AI with extremely capable and unique combat, stealth, and reconnaissance abilities. And to top it all off, she has extensive knowledge on every technological aspect of the Council's operation. They have zero reason to leave her alive, and especially not with their enemy. Third, they leave Dredd's ship apparently dead in the water, but there's quite literally no reason at all that the Council wouldn't just destroy the ship entirely. They just assume that it's completely out of commission because they shot the core. Here's why. It makes even less than no sense for them to even think the ship won't run again. Rusty turns the entire ship back on by rerouting the solar panels into the ship's energy, which means there is an alternative energy source for the ship to work on in an emergency.
Rerouting stored energy from solar collectors to ignition systems.
So clearly the Chaos Council would know that there's a way to reroute energy. Otherwise, why else would there be solar panels on the ship? They're the ones who operate these ships, and they're also extremely savvy with technology themselves. The only conclusion would be for them to destroy the ship in its entirety. They would have to actively decide on leaving the ship dead in the water and purposely shoot themselves in the foot. Couple that with them leaving Rusty Rose, it just makes no sense. And it's unfortunately more lazy writing. During a scuffle among the Council and the pirates, Dredd somehow convinces the crew that Sonic has abandoned them, even though there's no way that they didn't clearly hear him shout the plan to Sonic about how they're all going to stay on the ship as Sonic gets the shard back.
Sonic, I've got it covered here. Go after the shard.
And even if somehow none of them heard Dredd say this, I mean, they can just look over at the other ship and see Sonic fighting Dr. Deep, which is literally what Dredd does.
39.
Okay. After Sonic does retrieve the shard, the crew just turns on him. Not a single one realizes that Sonic was literally fighting to get the shard back, which was the entire plan all along. And then the episode just ends in a kind of cliffhanger because the pirate crew are like, how dare you fight the actual people leading the charge rather than the charge itself, all by yourself. Alone, while we take care of the robots that we kill in one hit. As if that was a compelling conclusion with how overtly forced Sonic's alleged betrayal was. And it continues into episode 4. Episode 4.
I'm trying to be dramatic.
This was one of the worst moments of part 2. In a crazy turn of events for Prime, Sonic is actually the smart one here. The pirates talk about how it clearly looked like Sonic was making a run for it, and Sonic literally brings up Dredd's plan and states that he even came back with the prism. So why would he be abandoning anybody? Even Batten is like, oh yeah, good point.
Since I'm standing right here, proving that I did come back.
He makes a good point.
But then not even 2 seconds later, she's trying to kill him? Like, what do you mean? What is happening? The writers flat out acknowledge how ridiculous this fallout is and then keep going with it anyway? What makes even less sense is that Sonic is like, I expected Dredd to take this hard, but not the rest of you. What? This entire plot point is beyond stupid. The actual point of contention would be the fact that Sonic wants to leave with the shard. You already have something that the crew is not going to like. Why even bother writing the secondary scenario that genuinely doesn't even make sense? None of the crew even believes that Sonic actually betrayed them. So you would assume they'd all be like, no, we don't want to fight Sonic, we trust him. I mean, we could just bring up part 1. They were ready to call Sonic Captain at the slightest hint of adventure, but now they're suddenly detrimentally loyal to Dread? Oh wait, they're not loyal to Dread at all, because eventually they decide that Sonic's a pretty okay guy and just start working with him again after Dread flies away with the shard. What is even happening in episode 4? Everybody just flips their alliance at the drop of a dime and then fully commits until they just magically don't. They shouldn't be following Dread at all. They all know that he's been a pretty garbage pirate, and his obsession with the shard is clear for every single character to see. And the crew already wasn't even really on board with him in part 1. They were essentially just happy they were able to be pirates. I wouldn't ever say at any point that these guys were ever really loyal to Dread. After Dread abandons his crew, the pirates tell Sonic to chase after him while they deal with the Egg Forcers. Dr. Deep catches up with the two, and he, out of nowhere, just starts trying to add a dramatic effect to their fight. I'm just sitting here watching it like, what? Why is he doing this? It just leaves him completely open so that the writers can allow Dread to shock him. So from what I can see, Dr. Deep seems to have had a change in writing. There is a massive focus on yoga and showboating for his character, which absolutely was not present in part 1. While I absolutely agree that he was always a more eccentric doctor, and he did dance in a room of robots before going into combat in part 1 during episode 3, Dr. Deep did not have this character trope of dramatic effect at any other moment. Him announcing himself is no different than any other villain that fights Sonic. Pretty much everybody has to announce himself before fighting him, but never did Dr. Deep stop fighting and be like, let me hit this pose real quick. At worst, Dr. Deep was just a bit clumsy in a fight with multiple bodies and had moments of comic relief, but he was never a showboater in the middle of a fight. Even looking at part 2, in episode 3 and the start of this episode, Dr. Deep doesn't have this aspect of his character. He fights immediately after engaging somebody, and that's been true for every fight he's been in until now. This bit where he wants to make his fight with Dread more dramatic just doesn't even make any sense. I don't know what is going on with the no play section, but there are just so many writing blunders in these 2 episodes where things just happen just for the sake of them happening. After Sonic and Dread's fight comes to an end, the Chaos Council finally breaches the gateway after being stopped by Shadow, and there comes a moment where the entire pirate crew is captured by Dr. Deep and Dr. Dunnett. 9 is also on the field, captured by, of course, Mr. Dr. Eggman. In order to remedy this, the council demands that Sonic give up the prism for his friends' lives. After Sonic throws the prism, all of his friends magically overpower the robots that had them hostage, including Dr. Deep. How they even got captured at all is never explained. Clearly, it just happened because the writers needed some way to advance the plot. Afterward, the pirates help Sonic enter the portal that sends everybody to New York. Yeah, those episodes were an absolute mess. Let's hope episode 5's better. Episode 5.
You're harnessing the energy of all 3 shards?
After arriving in New York and explaining to Nux and Rebel what's been going on in Sonic's absence from the city, Sonic gains this stance that he should actually be taking the shards alone. And here's where the friends helping him get into the portals comes into play. In both Boss Cage Maze and No Place, not only was Sonic fully on board with wanting everybody to help him, but they're also the entire reason that Sonic was able to keep chasing the council. This character trait for Sonic seemingly comes out of thin air and doesn't really make any sort of sense at all. The reason that Sonic wants to just get the shard by himself is because Rebel and Nux don't really trust 9. And Nux says that they don't really trust Sonic, which is obviously completely false. Rebel makes Sonic feel bad by saying, well, don't let us slow you down, to which Sonic just can't bring himself to leave them. So he tries convincing them to leave again and again, as they travel through New York to the council's headquarters. That way, he doesn't have to take the blame of making them leave. In Boss Cage Maze, Sonic tried to convince the Jungle Gang to join up and fight, and even in No Place, Sonic wanted full assistance of the pirates, even though they were very untrustable themselves. Suddenly, because the rebels say they don't really trust Nine, that's apparently enough for Sonic to just be like, screw it, I'll just do it myself? Shouldn't he be trying to get everybody to work together like he did everywhere else? And then later, after they come face to face with a horde of super-powered robots enhanced by the prism shards, which we'll get to in a moment, Sonic tries one last time to make them leave before fighting. Suddenly, Rebel Rouge places her full entire trust into Sonic, and Nux is on board too, which actually makes Sonic happy, and then they go full combat mode and start magically obliterating the army that was marching in front of them, you know, as though the superpowered robots are just nothing now. And then after the fight, Sonic is again like, so anyway guys, you should leave, I'll do the rest. The motivations are entirely lost in this episode, and nothing is consistent at all. At the end of the episode, after getting a call from somebody that is so obviously not Nine,
Bring your friends to the southwest doors.
You okay? You sound strange.
Sonic and the rebels make it to the Egg Council headquarters through an alleged secured way in. Here, Sonic comes face to face with the metal version of himself. Episode 6.
See if you can keep up with the original.
The metal version of Sonic turns out to be a massive goofball. But he's supposed to be like Sonic, but if Sonic were evil. And his name?
The name is Chaos Sonic, like regular Sonic, but with twice the charm and none of the failure.
He actually manages to annoy the hell out of Sonic during their fight together, which I find to be pretty hilarious, given the fact that Sonic is extremely annoying himself in the show. Chaos Sonic is specifically designed by the instructions that Nine accidentally gave to Mr. Dr. Eggman while discussing why he can never beat Sonic, and through the Prism's help, Mr. Dr. Eggman has created something that not even Sonic is able to beat by himself. Sonic comes off as very surprised that there's a metal version of himself here, even though it's one of the most likely things that he could possibly come into contact with while battling a team of 5 Eggman. What Sonic expresses upon seeing Chaos Sonic isn't like a sarcastic remark or annoyance that there's another Metal Sonic in these dimensions. No, the expression on Sonic's face, followed by his slow delivery that there could possibly be a knockoff version of himself, is confusion in its purest form.
Is that a knockoff me?
There's growing tension among the Chaos Council. We see this extreme clash of everybody's personalities that could lead up to a possible breaking point in Part 3. There were obvious disagreements in Part 1, and of course Episode 5 of Part 2, as the Council return to New York, and they argue about temporarily leaving the city in the hands of the rebels. But in the flashback for how New York's leadership was divided, we see that there was already a massive amount of dissonance among the council. While they can work independently perfectly fine, coming together always puts them at odds with each other. They agree to come together as equals and divide the city into 5 sections to give them freedom to run it as they please. With the 5 prism shards coming into play, the plan expands as they learn that they can create whatever they want thanks to the shards. At first, the doctors all come up with changes to make to the city itself, but thanks to Dr. Donut's intervention, stating that they should expand beyond the city, Mr. Dr. Eggman switches his ideals to opening the portals forever and granting an entire dimension to each version of Eggman. Which is exactly what I said should already have been happening in Part 1. The show being only 3 parts isn't going to be long enough to actually tackle this idea, so obviously their plan is going to have to immediately be stomped. It's still an interesting concept, and again, would have been easily done in 3 seasons had they set it up correctly. The Grim is a solo dimension, and Ghost Hill is Sonic's dimension, so you'd end up with 2 villains a season, and end it with Mr. Dr. Eggman. But back to how Prime is actually writing the show, expect a massive fallout among the Doctors in Part 3. Oh, also, just to put the final nail in this coffin for the lore discrepancy in Sonic Prime that I talked about in Part 1. In Part 1, we see that Nine was raised in a city. The council specifically say in this episode that all they have is this one city that is placed on Green Hill. They didn't steal Tails from West Side Island, and there's no reason or any possible way that he traveled to Green Hill. He's literally just born and raised in New York City, as are his bullies. Don't know how that's possible, but it certainly is the case. Check out my part 1 review for the full recap on how the story can't be canon. Since I did note that Sonic seems overly shocked that a metal version of himself could possibly exist, I think it's only fair that I comment about when Knucks comes face to face with his pirate self, and for some reason, he's confused about the existence of this character. Sonic literally told him that Dread was in New York City somewhere. Why would Knucks and Rebel be like, another Knuckles? What's happening? Sonic is even like, don't question it, as if he hasn't repeated this story to them twice now. The first was in part 1, episode 6, while Sonic and Knucks are fighting Egg Forcers, and it's not like Knucks wasn't listening. He even fully responds to the story.
And I got zipped into another world with another you fighting another battle.
Shock. Do you mean that energy crystal?
The second time is in part 2, episode 5, where Sonic tells Knucks everything he's been up to since teleporting out of New York again.
Where did you come from?
Well...
Fire!
Knucks should actually be even more prepared to see a second version of himself, as not only did Sonic say that Dread is here, but it's the second time Knucks has been told that there's another version of himself out there. I'll grant him being surprised to see his own doppelganger, but not complete confusion on just what he's even looking at. Especially not after Sonic just told him that Dread is in New York. Chaos Sonic is defeated by Nine, leading Sonic up to the council's headquarters to where the prism shards are. From there, Nine blasts Chaos Sonic with a massive beam that somehow Sonic is able to dodge, but the much more capable, AI superpowered, and possibly even faster Chaos Sonic isn't able to dodge the laser. Yet neither Sonic or Chaos Sonic even knew this laser was going to come at them. Lucky for Sonic, huh? Episode 7.
This is the friend Sonic thought was like me? We're nothing alike.
During episode 7, we get a short dive into Nine's motivations and character. It was already obvious that Nine had no intention of bringing Green Hill back to normal. We know this because Sonic and him already had this argument in part 1, episode 6. What I find extremely endearing and pivotal to note about Nine is that he has an understanding of the world that Sonic wants back.
It could be home. The one you lost. The one I never had. I can make that hope a reality for both of us.
So instead of turning the Grim into something that Nine himself might find more enjoyable, Nine actually begins turning it into a brand new Green Hill in the hopes that Sonic will actually fall in love with the idea. What makes this a great moment is that, first of all, Nine wouldn't actually know what Green Hill looked like. As far as we've seen, Nine has never experienced what New York City was before the Egg Council took over. And even when looking at what's left of Green Hill, the palm trees are all removed, save for the one inside of the Rebels' headquarters, which, again, Nine never saw. The endearing part about this scene, and of Nine, is that it references something from the very first episode of part 1. While Sonic is fighting Nine, Sonic specifically lays out what iconic parts of Green Hill are like.
Don't you want to go home? Blue skies, sunny beaches, palm trees?
Nine remembers that entire conversation that he had with Sonic. Nine's character having a lack of any friends, yet Sonic trying his hardest to be his first real friend, has clearly been rubbing off on Nine. So even if he's a rough character by himself, it's clear that the only person he would ever place his entire trust into is Sonic, going as far as to mold the dimension that he found all on his own to fit something that Sonic would be familiar with and care about. The Shatter Ship may even be inspired by the conversation that Sonic had with Nine about Tails having a plane.
You have the coolest plane.
I do?
It's called the Tornado.
9 is unintentionally becoming the Tails that Sonic actually wants. In the last episode, we saw that the doctors were able to use the prism to create superpowered versions of the Egg Forces, adding whatever designs they want to them, or in the first case, just make them bigger. We then see that the prism was made to create Chaos Sonic, and now this episode, we see that it can even create palm trees. The prism being able to create anything somebody can think of also has an implication. The implication is that the Paradox Prism can create anything from the imagination of those who are able to harness its energy. In episode 5, as 9 says to Mr. Dr. Eggman,
"You're the ones with unlimited power, and all you can think to do is build a bigger robot."
Clearly a dig at the small mind of the Doctor, but unknown to 9, Mr. Dr. Eggman is actually trying to get him to come up with an invention all on his own. This is where 9 starts explaining all of the things that make Sonic impossible to beat, believing that it will annoy the Doctor. However, Mr. Dr. Eggman then uses this information to create Chaos Sonic. How they can even activate the prism to perform this action is never explained. 9 and the council just kind of do it. So there are many implications and problems if that is the case. First of all, if the prism can make anything you can imagine, well then this concept is similar to Movie Sonic and their emeralds, where Sonic can summon anything he wants at any time as Super Sonic, which is also a dumb idea. But secondly, the extreme implication is that anybody who has the prism shards can essentially create an endless amount of things as long as they can think it up. While it's possible that 9 has seen a picture of a palm tree and beaches, it's extremely unlikely that New York has some sort of advanced connected internet system that anybody can just join up on and research the properties of trees and coconuts. So the only conclusion would be that the prism will do all of that research for 9 and the council. It's also possible that the more prism shards you have, the more things you can create. So if one were to acquire all 5 shards, the holder could create anything to stop anybody from gaining access to them. The prism is even proven to interact with the world itself, as we've seen in Boss Cage Maze with the tree pillars, as well as obviously creating 5 separate dimensions. So there's a lot that could happen should it fall into the wrong hands. And if you can create anything you can think of, well, there's nothing restricting you from making an invulnerable, overpowered robot, or something worse, like something that could just delete somebody if it spots them. Creating an object that can create anything somebody can think of is story-breaking, overpowered, and doesn't actually make sense. Because there's no reason that a character wouldn't do a variety of things while it's in their possession. I mean, just think about what you can do with the object that can create anything you wanted. And it's also an endless supply of energy. So you can do this forever. So here's something that I know for a fact that the writers completely forgot about. The Chaos Council launched their plan for multi-dimensional domination with the plan to give each of the 5 doctors one of the 5 dimensions. They don't really know where the last 2 prisms are, but regardless, they begin opening the portals and leaving them open so that they can assist each other at any time. Of course, Sonic and 9 are able to steal the prism shards before they can fully realize this plan, and the council now have to chase them through the portals. Here's the part the writers forgot about. We know, without a doubt, that time moves much faster in Boss Cage Maze in comparison to other dimensions. The others, sure, they might go slower, okay, the same, or maybe time also moves faster for them. But we know, with full confirmation, that Boss Cage Maze has some sort of time ripple that makes a day become anywhere from a couple to even several weeks in New York, as stated by Sonic and Rebel Rouge in Part 1, Episode 6.
A day? You've been gone weeks.
Weeks? Really? Time must move differently there.
So how exactly would time work while Boss Cage Maze is open like this? Does time just become completely neutral? Or will looking in the portal make New York run at some sort of insane super speed? Is that ever going to be brought up again? How long was Shadow floating outside of these gateways? How did the Council make it to Boss Cage Maze in time? They wouldn't even know to calculate the time. Dr. Don't and Dr. Babble could have been waiting days or even months, waiting for the mothership to come and pick them up. Yet it arrives at the perfect time, just as they need them to come in, as though time is congruent everywhere suddenly. And finally, we reach the end of part 2. Sonic, Nine, and Shadow all head to Green Hill to place the shards in the original blueprint model inside of the temple. However, there's a problem. Nine, of course, only wants to understand what the shards are supposed to look like when put together, while Sonic and Shadow want the shards to be placed into Green Hill so that everything can go back to normal. Remember, Shadow doesn't trust Nine to actually fulfill this, while Sonic fully thinks that Nine is on board with the plan. The Council then breach into Green Hill, forcing Sonic and Shadow to fight them off to defend Nine as he rearranges the Prism shards. Before we head into the final episode, let's quickly talk about Sonic's progression as a character. Oh, and while I got you here, don't forget to like and leave a comment if you haven't already, subscribe to join the Eggman Empire. You know, you're clearly loving the vibe. Don't be shy, I'd love to talk to all of you, even if you don't agree with me on anything. Oh, and maybe even follow me on Twitter. I occasionally butt heads with the Sonic community on there. Can we say that Sonic is actually changing throughout the story? I wouldn't say so. I think from everything we've seen so far in part 2, Sonic is very much unchanged from who he was when the show began. The biggest hint at development Sonic has had so far is when he was talking to Shadow, and he agrees that he is to blame for creating the Shadowverses. However, Sonic clearly hasn't learned his lesson yet, as he's still overprotective of all his friends, especially Tails, or Nine in this case, and still isn't listening when people tell him not to do something and warn him that something isn't safe or is an obvious trap, especially if that advice happens to come from Shadow, who Sonic is just for some reason a massive jerk to. Episode 8.
What did you think would happen to me when you brought your friends back?
In episode 8, the Council, Sonic, and Shadow all duke it out, with the tides changing here and there throughout. At one point, Nine is almost overcome by egg forces as well. During this time, Nine temporarily brings life back into Green Hill, once again awakening the holograms of Tails, Amy, and the rest of Sonic's friends. So, somewhere, somehow, Sonic's friends actually are safe and don't appear to have any recollection of what's been going on. However, Nine continues tampering with the shards, and Sonic's friends are once again plunged into their holographic slumber. So that's interesting. Nine didn't even complete the blueprint in its entirety, yet an explosion came off that was able to bring back Sonic's friends. What's even more interesting is that Nine and Tails were, assumedly, in the same place at the same time. Eventually, all of the doctors are put out of commission except for Mr. Dr. Eggman. This is due to Sonic taking on a good amount of the Prism energy, making him go extremely fast to the point that nobody can keep up with him or even hit him. Mr. Dr. Eggman unleashes his final trump card, redirecting the reserve power of the shards to create this prismatic titan, as Nine calls it. It's an enormous mass of prism energy in the image of the original Dr. Eggman. Mr. Dr. Eggman refers to it as
the pinnacle of all creation!
Assuming that he's just talking about using the prism energy to make a giant version of himself, Sonic decides to take on as much power of the shards as he can, and the prismatic titan is defeated by Sonic's almost completed transformation in an instant. This brings up something that I find important to note about Part 2 overall. This auto-resolution storytelling that Part 2 keeps presenting. Episode 2, Sonic can now talk to Nine and no longer teleports after touching shards. Episode 5, with the upgraded egg forces that are defeated by the rebels easily without any effort, in contrast to Part 1, Episode 3, where it was almost impossible to even defeat the enhanced egg forcers, until Sonic decided to spin dash everybody, and that was just the end of that fight, of course. Now, again, the auto-resolve presents itself in the final battle of Part 2, with the prismatic titan just being defeated by Sonic jumping in his mouth, and the titan falls to his death. Thankfully, there are are instances where the characters actually have to try to win, such as while fighting Chaos Sonic and when Sonic and Shadow are fighting each other, but the final fight just ending. Pretty anticlimactic and once again, lazy writing. Sonic's new form is great though, don't get me wrong. Anytime all of Sonic's issues aren't solved by the Chaos Emeralds is an absolute win for the franchise. This new form is problematically overpowered though, and it isn't even completed yet. Sonic was still missing the final shard when he attacked the Prismatic Titan. And again, I'd like to note a difference between Sonic Prime and the actual Sonic here. When Sonic goes supersonic, he flies at speeds that are, well, supersonic and beyond. Before nearly completing this prism form, Sonic was able to create after images of himself that he has conversations with. Never has Sonic ever made an after image of himself and began talking to it. This is among one of the clearest depictions that Prime Sonic is nothing like his video game counterpart.
Now that's how it's done. Not bad. Oh, like you could do better.
Even in extremely dire and world-ending threats, Prime Sonic just can't stop making a joke out of everything. Which is why when Sonic finally got the majority of the Prism energy placed into him, except for the final shard, I was actually happy to finally see Sonic throw away all depictions of childlike wonder and get completely serious to the point that he doesn't even utter a single word. Just pure determination. That's right. The best part about Sonic in Sonic Prime is when he stops talking. After this fight ends, Sonic just returns to his prime self and is excited to tell Nine that they can get the last shard and return to Green Hill. However, Nine doesn't want to bring Green Hill back. He doesn't care about some place that he's never lived. He just doesn't have the same connection to the place that Sonic has. Sonic and Nine's fallout is a pivotal moment of the show because it finally addresses an extremely harsh reality of the series. At some point, will Nine, Dread, Prim, Rusty, and all of the Egg Councils cease to exist? In the best case scenario, they will still exist independently inside of the Paradox Prism, but the reality may very well be that all of these characters will have to once again either become whole or just be gone. While the show doesn't directly say anything about this quite yet, it will have to come to terms with the fact that these characters might not be alive anymore after this show ends. Nine's opinion is that Sonic should move on and focus on what's happening now. Green Hill is gone. On top of this, he worries that Sonic will just forget about him after Tails is back. Of course, to Nine, he spent his whole life believing that his world is real. The concept of him not being real would never cross his mind. He was born and has been living his life for years, long before Sonic even arrived. While in Sonic's mind, Nine just now started existing. Of course, the stupidity of Prime Sonic showing here. Once the shards are put back, he thinks that there will just be 3 other versions of Tails and his friends walking around. Hopefully even becoming friends with each other. You tell me. What would you do and how would you feel if you lived your whole life up to this moment right now, only for somebody to come in and say that you and your entire universe was never even supposed to exist? And on top of that, the person that tells you that your universe was never supposed to exist wants you to help them fix their universe so they can get their version of you and you will cease to exist. That is the most adult thing that Sonic Prime actually offers to the audience, which is the concept of somebody's necessary or unnecessary existence. And with this disagreement, Nine steals the shards, shouting at Sonic that he is real. The only difference is that he's just not the Tails that Sonic wants. Sonic is left on the floor, emotionally defeated by a shade of his best friend. Shadow arrives just as Nine enters a portal taking him to the void, heading to obtain the final shard for himself. Part 2 is better than the first, but only by a small amount. While Part 1 was filled with overdrawn exposition and unnecessary setup, even adding in a whole side story in episodes 4 and 5, Part 2 maintains a solid pace throughout. The show technically could have gone on for as long as they wanted, even making each season about one of the 5 prisms if they wanted to. It's So far, a story that's okay in terms of how it's put together, being only 3 parts. I think it's very good of Sonic Prime to maintain only 4 versions of each character, possibly 5 versions if the Grimm ends up having some version of the characters. With only 8 episodes left, I mean, there's not really much else they'll have time to add. They'll really have to start wrapping it up with 9 being the new antagonist, and the threat of the Council still looming overhead. Will we find out what's going on with the Abyss? Will the Chaos Council be sent down there? Will Sonic? Will we ever get that Chaos Emerald back? Will Shadow no longer be barred from entering the dimensions if he can retrieve the Chaos Emerald? Will 9 erase everyone with the 5 Paradox Prism Shards? Is this all just a fake story that has nothing to do with anything and will never be referenced again? I guess we'll just have to find out next time when part 3 drops. Subscribe, like, comment, follow me on Twitter. Okay, bye!